rules. Yet Christianity was being challenged from both within and without, with many Christians deeply unhappy with the Vatican's abuses of power and calling into question problematic Catholic dogma. Others who simply wanted to worship God in their own ways were also threatening the power and influence of the church, and that could not be tolerated. Publicly proclaiming that there could be only one road to God and all else was dangerous heresy that threatened to steer people away from God's love, the Inquisition was launched in the late 12th century. Though sadly the truth was that the church was more concerned with securing its own power and wealth rather than the souls of the faithful it claimed were being threatened. The inquisitors were specially trained priests who were instructed in the art of discovering heresy and rooting it out, then extracting penance and confessions from heretics, almost always through torture. When an inquisitor arrived in town, he would immediately announce his presence to the local population and would give citizens present a chance to admit their heresy. If they did, then they would be doled out a punishment befitting their level of heresy, everything from a forced pilgrimage to holy sites in Rome to severe whippings which could scar a person for life. For inquisitors, true penance could only be achieved through deep pain. Thus, most inquisitors would make use of special bullwhips, which would come with small metal beads at the end, in order to deeply lacerate flesh. Others still used a tool known as a cat of nine tails, which was a whip with 9 extensions, typically with each one inlaid with pieces of sharpened metal. The wounds would be so severe that often those receiving this punishment would die from infection or be crippled afterwards. Those that survived bore the scars for life, their backs forever disfigured by the horrible whipping. This was, of course, lighter punishment reserved for those who freely confessed. If one did not confess, the inquisitor would immediately begin their investigation, calling in local townsfolk for one-on-one meetings. Citizens were encouraged to speak up about the heretical practices of their neighbors, and once accused, there was often little evidence needed to determine guilt. This led to many cases of revenge in the form of false accusations by angry neighbors, or perhaps just by individuals who coveted the lands and even the wives of others for themselves. With the scantest proof of heresy, one could convince an inquisitor that their neighbor was a horrible heretic, deserving of the fires of hell itself. Of course, the church itself hardly ever needed much incentive to persecute people as heretics. Count Raymond VII of Toulouse would regularly burn people at the stake for heresy, even if they had confessed when given an opportunity, because often those who were persecuted were Jews, Muslims, or other religious minorities. The process of killing them was little more than a handy way to cleanse the population of undesirables. That included gays who were persecuted under the laws of sodomy and brutally tortured before being killed. In the Kingdom of Aragon in Spain, the Inquisition only stopped giving out the death penalty for sodomy after almost 1,000 trials, most of which ended with torture and death for the accused. Diego Rodriguez Lucero, an inquisitor named the Inquisitor extracting confessions, was paramount, and it mattered little whether they were real or false. Inevitably, the accused would face one of many different forms of punishment, which weren't meant to actually punish the individual, but rather to just get them to confess. One of the preferred methods of exacting confessions was called strapado. In this form of torture, an individual would have their hands tied behind their back and the rope attached to a pulley. They were then raised so that they would hang from their arms, which would inevitably lead to the shoulders being pulled out of their sockets. Often, the inquisitor would raise the victim up high and suddenly drop them before catching their fall, forcing the body to jerk violently. As if this wasn't enough, weights would often be tied to the person's feet to make the hanging even more painful. The rack was yet another popular tool of the Inquisition, and a very effective one at that. Here, the subject had their hands and feet tied or chained up to rollers at one or perhaps both ends of a wooden frame. The inquisitor would then slowly turn the rollers with a handle, which pulled on the ropes or chains and stretched the victim's arms and legs until they dislocated. Sometimes, the process would simply continue until limbs were torn off completely. Even though mutilation was forbidden by the Church, in 1256, Pope Alexander IV gave inquisitors the power to forgive each other for any wrongdoing they committed during their torture sessions. One of the most horrific implements of torture was known as the breast ripper, which was nothing more than a prong-like iron device which would be heated in a fire and then affixed over each breast, with the inquisitor violently ripping away the breast tissue until there was little more left than a mass of cauterized tissue. All of these were things the victims would suffer, along with their normal torture, and designed to not just extract confessions, but ensure that the guilty would be forever marked by the ordeal.